Hello and welcome to Have You Heard, where we explore science in the news. Each episode, a group of us will discuss a piece of scientific news that has caught our attention and reveal the real story behind the dramatic headlines. For example,
have you heard that eating poo might be really good for you?
Have you heard probiotics are quite useless?
No. I have heard that probiotics could be the new mood-inducing psycho-drug.
This episode will be discussing news stories that relate to the bacteria inside us.
Today we're joined by a microbiome researcher from the University of Manchester.
Hi, I'm Paul Campbell. I'm currently waiting on ethical approval to collect people's poo.
Oh no.
I'm Luke Chaplin. I'm allergic to penicillin, although I actually suspect not really.
But the doctor's not really gonna just hand that over to you. Go, give it a go. I am Kate Downs, and my fun fact is that 2 weeks ago I was in hospital with food poisoning, and instead of prescribing me antibiotics, my doctor prescribed me a probiotic, which is basically a yoghurt. I was not impressed.
How incredibly relevant. So, Paul, you're actively trying to receive poo. Is that my understanding?
Desperately. Do you have any?
So why are you trying to get people to give you their poo?
My project is on the oral microbiome for people on immunosuppressants, particularly kidney transplant patients at the minute.
Right, let's start with breaking down. So what is the microbiome? And I thought it was just in the gut.
So basically you are 3 times 10 to the 13 human cells. That's a big number. It's 3 with 13 zeros.
Oh, yeah. Lots. That's a lot, yeah.
You are loads of human cells. However, you are 3.8 times 10 to the 13 bacterial cells.
So I'm more bacteria than human.
Yeah.
By 0.8 times 10 to the 13.
Yeah, that's right.
Crikey.
And so
that's very impressive.
In normal medicine, what we focus on is what that 3 times 10 to the 13 human cells are doing. But more recently, we're looking at what those bacterial cells are doing and how they interact with health.
So where are these bacteria in your body?
So they are literally living on and inside of you.
So everywhere?
Basically everywhere. There's very few considered sterile places in the human body.
Yeah, I feel slightly itchy.
Well,
yeah, very slightly itchy.
Well, you see, it's nothing really to be grossed out about, because for as long as multi-cellular beings, which we are, have been evolving, so too have the bacterial cells with us. That's a symbiosis that's been going on for millions of years.
Sounds like lots, but actually it's just the normal amount that's all.
It's completely
you've always had them.
Yeah.
Okay. And up until relatively recently, we sort of ignored them in terms of health.
Yeah.
Apart from, say, when you get infected by something that you don't usually have, and that establishes itself as, I don't know, food poisoning. So what do we know about these normal bacteria that live in us?
So what we know first of all is that they're really important. So for a long time it was considered that we were almost sterile, or sterilised, that we don't have things living on or in us.
Because that's what the skin is about, is keeping the outside and not inside.
Yeah, so you pick up a hand gel that's 99.9% it's going to get rid of the bacteria, and you want sterile hands. And for a long time that was kind of the conception. But now we're starting to realise that this bacteria is actually quite important to our health. And there's quite a few ways. Probably the most basic way that it's helpful is just by being there. So the fact that you can have, let's say, friendly bacteria or a non-pathogenic, non-harmful bacteria living on that space, just by being there, can prevent a infectious or pathogenic bacteria from living on the same space.
So it sort of competes. So good bacteria are competing with bad bacteria, and you want the good bacteria to win.
Yeah, I don't really like the good bacteria versus bad bacteria.
That was going to be my exact question now, is does good bacteria exist? Is that a useful way of talking about them?
Not necessarily, because what you could consider a good bacteria in your microbiome that's in so many healthy people, you could go through all these healthy people and you'd find this bacteria consistently. But then when a microbiome changes, it can be the same bacteria that's just kind of growing out of control, or it's just enumerated, and all of a sudden it's a problem.
So it's a sort of repertoire of bacteria
It makes it sound exotic, the bacteria that I've got on me. The whole repertoire.
So your repertoire of bacteria that are on you, it's not just what's there, it's the proportion in which they're there.
Yeah, definitely. Like the composition is really important.
Okay.
It's almost like you could think of it as
like a garden.
Yeah, like a garden. You could say you're happy with a certain amount of grass, but then if something happens to your garden, all of a sudden grass is growing where it shouldn't be growing.
Yeah.
And it's stopping other flowers from growing because it's everywhere.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. So it's not helpful to say good and bad bacteria.
Yeah.
It's more you're looking for a balance between the bacteria that usually...
and balance is kind of the key word when you come to microbiomes.
Okay, that's interesting.
So say I talk about my microbiome, I'm talking about the bacteria that you'd find on and in my body and the proportions of them. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, what else do bacteria do within us? So one of the main ones that I've heard is that they help us break down our food. So more complex things. So for example, you can't break down lentils without bacteria in your stomach.
Oh, really?
They need to break it down first, then you can properly break it down.
It's really cool.
Interesting.
They're the reason that your sweat smells. So
That's
pure sweat actually doesn't smell of what we class sweat to smell of. The bacteria that live on our skin break it down into an aromatic compound that is what we know the body odour smell to be. Oh, speaking of bacteria and smells, this has got nothing to do
what
with...
a weird segue. This could literally go anywhere.
It is literally going to go nowhere, you think. It's my favourite fact that I like to throw out to non-biologists anywhere, and they're just like, yeah, okay. The smell of rain after a hot day, that is bacteria. So you've got...
There's petrichor.
Yes, petrichor is the bacteria. It's the
That's
smell.
the fun fact I like to
So you get that lovely smell of rain after it's not rained for a while, which happens ever so occasionally in Manchester.
It's never happened in Manchester ever. There's never been a time when it wasn't raining.
Raining, yeah.
So babies born naturally versus those born with C-sections have different skin microbiomes, which is pretty cool. And that's what's leading to the vaginal seeding idea, that if you are born by a C-section, maybe you could take a swab and swab the skin of the baby.
That is not what I imagined vaginal seeding would mean. I sort of imagined
Please
it
tell
as...
us what you're
We're going back to the
It's just
gardening analogy.
taking a baby and just rubbing it against a vagina.
What a welcome to the world.
That's such an unscientific way of doing it.
Some people think that the inflammatory bowel diseases, that could potentially be your immune system. It no longer recognises your normal constituents as normal constituents, and it overreacts. It becomes inflamed and starts trying to get rid of things that would usually be there.
There's that whole sort of community that's normally there in your gut, which suddenly your body's gone, oh my god, infection.
So now it's inflamed,
Inflamed.
and not only is it inflamed, it's taken away bacteria that does have a function in your digestion.
Okay, so this is so inflammatory bowel disease was that ulcerative colitis and
that's one type.
Crohn's?
Crohn's, yeah.
And so the idea is that kind of inflammation in your intestines and things, which causes kind of a lot of discomfort and kind of bad symptoms, might be your body attacking germs that are in your gut
possibly.
that it shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's a theory, is that it no longer sees those bacteria as part of the self, part of the superorganism that is human cells and your bacterial cells, yeah.
I certainly am a superorganism. That's quite interesting. IBS is a big one that gets thrown around.
Definitely. And I think that was kind of the first that people noticed there might be a microbiome involvement in.
So they're looking at a lot of different diseases now that might be related.
Similar thing to what you touched on is C. difficile, which can happen when people are quite sick already. You can also get an infection called C. difficile, which is caused by a bacteria called Colostrum difficile. Again, that is something that is usually found in a healthy person's microbiome, but it can grow out of control in certain situations.
Oh, okay. So it's not kept in check.
In hospitals, it's always said with an amount of dread.
So C. diff is really cool because this is kind of like the first success story for microbiome research.
Oh, cool.
Nice.
So the treatment for a C. diff infection at the moment is for you to take an antibiotic, possibly, which will clear out your, let's say, unbalanced microbiome. And then they will actually give you a transplant of a healthy person's microbiome.
How is that done, Paul?
It's in the form of a rather large frozen poo tablet, usually.
Oh, gross!
Was not expecting the phrase poo tablet, but I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Which
Frozen poo tablets?
It's not available at your local Lloyd's. The idea is you're going to clear out that person's unbalanced, C. difficile populated microbiome. You want to clear that out and put in usual healthy constituents back.
One of the things that gets me about poo transplants
is what we should
we
be
will
calling
go
it.
on to.
Sorry, Paul, what was the technical term for it?
It's a fecal microbiome transplant.
Okay.
I'm happy with poo tablets. That's
so we're
fine.
going to call it a poo transplant or a poo tablet from now on. I kind of assumed that you're trying to get the microbiome from one person into the other because one person's has gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I assumed that you kind of took a poo sample and put it up the other person.
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay.
That's
Ouch.
one way of doing it.
Oh, I'm not enjoying this episode.
But there's also, you can like freeze it into a tablet.
Yeah,
And
and
then
swallow
swallow
it.
it.
Yeah, so I mean,
Oh.
they have different kind of
Does it
tablets.
taste bad? Do they
I've
sugarcoat it?
I've never tried it.
Do they sugarcoat it?
Oh, nice. 2 minutes. Love it. I've been looking at an article called Probiotics labelled quite useless. Quite useless as in little quotation marks.
If I was making probiotics, I probably wouldn't put that on the label.
Yeah. It doesn't do anything, is it?
Yeah, like a book cover.
Yeah.
Quite useless. Okay, that's quite a claim.
It is. I'd say that's the main problem I had with this article,
Okay.
is that claim. Although I think, because they're introducing a quote, it's a very certain sentence to say about something that there's a lot of research going on at the moment. But yeah, so this is an article on BBC News. So it's covering a recent paper from a research paper from last year that came out. But yes, so that it kind of opens quickly with that, and then goes into more detail and explains the situation. So to do this, have you heard style? So how did they find out? A group of scientists took 25 people, so they're all healthy volunteers, and they had a look at their microbiomes. I'll get into how they did that in a bit.
Yeah, I was going to say.
But they had a look at their microbiome before, and then they gave them what they describe as a cocktail of bacteria.
Coming to a bar near you.
Yeah. But yeah, so apparently it was a cocktail of 11 common good bacteria. That's how they phrase it. We've discussed why good bacteria might not be a great phrase.
And why
in
common
this.
might not even be a good phrase
Yeah.
there, because my common
if
might be
everyone
different to
has
your
a
common.
unique thing, yeah, common wouldn't have that important a meaning. I don't
Yeah, there are some that you'd always expect to be there. You'd always expect to be there in a big number, but
Okay.
you couldn't necessarily say that everyone has 50% of blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not quite how it
But
works.
they gave them this cocktail of bacteria for a month, and they assessed the microbiome after that.
And so
to compare them.
are there other diets completely normal? They just take this cocktail, say, once a day sort of vibe?
Yes, it's every day for a month. And they also had another group that had a placebo. So they just had, I think, a cellulose. So just, from what I can gather, just a kind of a similarly thick fluid that didn't have any bacteria.
Okay.
You always want to compare to a group that's done something similar but doesn't have the
active
essential bits,
ingredient, yeah.
the bacteria.
But I suppose 25, that's not very
25
large.
It's not a huge sample.
Especially
of people.
for discussing something like the microbiome, where you have a lot of inherent variety.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge in the field because you're trying to recruit as many people as possible. But also because you can say that healthy people, there's such a big difference between two healthy people.
Yeah.
You need as big a group as possible to sample from, just to kind of take into account the fact that people are
The
different.
natural variation between individuals.
I wonder whether this will ever stem into the sort of like the Human Genome Project, the Human Microbiome Project.
That
That
would be
exists.
really
Oh, it
useful.
exists.
The Human Microbiome Project's the thing.
Oh, nice.
And the Human Oral Microbiome Project more
Ah.
recently. But yeah.
But yeah, so in terms of the amount of people involved, I think this study was limited by... So the way they assessed the microbiome was slightly more invasive than a lot of studies. So a lot of the microbiome is assessed through poo samples. So you look at poo and what bacteria there.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the lining of your insides, your intestines and things there's bacteria there that might not necessarily be represented in a stool sample.
Yeah, so you have the mucosal membrane. It's like mucus that lives on the surface.
So it's like the lining of the inside of your gut.
So all of that mucus will also be shed, as well as the bacteria inside your gut. So all of a sudden, if you're looking at a poo sample, the difficulty is saying which has definitely come from the gut and which might be there because it's come from that mucus that has been shed on the way down.
Okay. So for this one, they ended up doing it by endoscope. So basically sticking a tube either down your mouth and into your stomach or up the other end and into your intestines. Taking a sample from the side of your intestine or your stomach and using that sample to see what bacteria there.
So yeah, now it does make sense why there's only, 25 of them?
Yeah,
I would say no.
This is the thing, is for anyone listening that has endured an endoscope, it's a bit rough. You generally have to sedate people, so you kind of give them a drug to
Bloody hope so.
Make them a bit out of it. And so yeah, it's not something you could easily say, oh, I want to do this to 1,000 people. It's a bit more invasive.
Yeah. I mean, how many people, if you walked up to them in the street and asked,
can I stick this?
Can I stick this?
Can I
down
probe
your mouth
you?
or up the other end? I think most people would say no. So
can we make little nanobots that crawl in?
Or shrink down people in massive submarines.
Ant-Man.
I've seen that done before.
Yeah.
Not in the real world, but in the film world. Yeah.
Interesting.
So they did this with the 25 people, looked at the differences before they gave them this cocktail, just after, and then 3 weeks after that.
Okay.
Is that a reasonable timescale?
Kind of. I think 3 weeks seems reasonable.
Okay.
But yeah, the idea was to see if there was a difference between the people who had the cocktail and the people who hadn't.
That's
And
quite good
also
that they're actually
comparing-
checking the microbiome itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then checking the same person between the kind of different time points.
Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd keep the longer you'd sample, the better, because you'd know how long. You could know for certain that is a lasting effect that keeps going.
Yeah.
If I come and plant a tree in your garden
And there's nothing after a week.
and check after 3 weeks and say, the tree is happy, is that enough time to know that the tree is happy?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So this is effectively what they found. About half of the participants showed no change in their microbiome afterwards, and then the other about half of the group found that it had a small change that then went away after time. So the natural kind of microbiome managed to counter any difference that the cocktail made.
Well, again, I mean, maybe we alluded to it earlier, that one of the big functions of your microbiome in health is the fact that you have the bacteria that your body knows is, safe, you can trust it, that's already occupying that space, and that stops.
It naturally maintains its
there, so nothing else can grow. So, again, maybe if you are drinking a certain type of bacteria, the fact that you already have something, we call it colonizing, something already living there,
that will naturally try and...
it's going to fight for its space.
It comes down to this, just because you're drinking a probiotic being a supplement that contains these bacteria that are supposed to be associated with some sort of good health thing. It doesn't mean that they're guaranteed to take up, I suppose, residence in where you want them to. They'll get there, but whether they'll find a little niche for them to nuzzle into is an entirely different question.
Exactly.
And it may work really well for me, but not say for anyone else or whatnot.
Yes, and that's a good point. So while the main tagline was that the probiotics are useless, the article does actually cover quite well, when you read it, that the scientists are basically making the point that because everyone's microbiome is so unique, it's unlikely that just a generic probiotic would be something that would be useful. You couldn't just give everyone a probiotic and claim that it's going to help.
Yeah, but I suppose that headline, it assumes that it doesn't work, which is not necessarily true.
Misleading.
Yeah, I would advise against that headline. I think that's a bad headline.
So in terms of the kind of who was running it, So this was a study done by Zamora et al.
Zamora publishes quite a lot. I heard that when the moon hits the sky like a big piece of pie.
That's Zamora.
That's Zamora.
Yeah.
I've heard that too.
I really like that. So this was a group spread between the Weizmann Institute of Science and the Tel Aviv Sourasky Medical Center. Both are in Israel. And in terms of kind of who else backs them up, they got a quote from a scientist that works in the same field but isn't connected to that team, which is always encouraging sign to get someone else to comment on it that isn't related to the project.
Agree to your point.
So there's a Dr. Trevor Lally who works at the Sange Institute. So he made a comment on it, which was effectively that it's not surprising, the findings, that probiotics have been around for a long time and they're kind of coming under increasing scrutiny now that microbiome research is in the spotlight. But yes, there's basically, he's saying that there's a lot of studies that are very preliminary and there needs to be a lot of repeating studies that have gone before. And like we said before, his comment was basically that the gut naturally has a balance that it reaches and it will try its best to keep that balance. So one question I did have, when they were examining the microbiomes and taking these samples, there's this thing, is it 16S DNA?
16S, it's usually RNA sequencing.
RNA sequencing.
So I can do this little bit and then pass over to you. You have DNA, gets made into RNA, and then RNA is what you use to decode what the protein is. So it's a 3-stage system.
Okay.
So the RNA is sort of what's being expressed at the moment. And I believe the interest in 16S RNA is because we as humans don't have it?
No, we don't.
No. So if you...
Yeah, so bacteria have it. It's basically a gene. It's highly conserved, so it doesn't change much. You know that if you have that sequence of RNA bases, you can say for certain that it's a bacteria, for example.
So depending on the species?
Yeah.
Sort of like a fingerprint?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it can be called DNA fingerprinting.
Oh, okay.
So it's a bit of DNA that can't have come from the person. It has to be
bacterial.
From a bacteria.
Yeah, so I mean, it has come from the person because it lives in the person, but it's the person's bacterial cells rather than...
So when you're looking at it, a sample, you know that the bacteria is...
Yeah, so I mean, the protocol could be, I will take poop, I will then extract all RNA from the poop, and then you break down the cells, you pluck out your genes, and you have these conserved regions, which you know it's going to be a bacterial, and then you have these less conserved regions, ones that change, ones that are different between species. Eventually, what you can do is, using that 16S rRNA, you can run that against a database, and that will tell you what the bacteria actually is, what that sequence is. And also you can look at the relative abundance, so how much of each species has come from that sample.
Okay, so that's a really clever bit of science, which leads quite nicely.
Do you have a retort?
I have a retort. I've come across 2 scientific articles which are very different. One of them I want to burn, and the other one is something that I think is very promising in the field of microbiome. So there was a headline that I saw in BuzzFeed that was, after a torrent of criticism, a journal just retracted a study pushing trendy gut makeover diet. And I saw the word trendy, gut and makeover and was like, yes, this clickbait has worked for me.
I was going to say, you've also gone for the highly reputable source of scientific news, BuzzFeed.
Yeah, it's where I get all of my citations from. Basically, there's this woman called Jeanette Hyde, who's a nutritional therapist, who has published a book and published a paper about this gut makeover diet, where she claims that this diet can cause microbiome restoration, which improves digestion, cognition, and physical and emotional well-being.
That is quite the claim.
It is quite the claim, and...
Poopy pills solve everything.
Yeah, that's... it's not even... It doesn't even have that level of science in it. This is why I want to burn it. And it's the reason it got retracted. This paper caused so much of a shitstorm.
Poop storm.
that several people who were on the peer review process quit.
Wow, that is a big deal.
So, what went wrong with this study for it to cause such a nightmare?
Yeah, we should clarify that, like, retraction of a research article is
rare.
It's quite rare, and it's a big deal.
It's career ruining, potentially. Yeah. So this paper was retracted over methodological concerns, despite being peer reviewed. So this is the point of the peer review process. It's meant to be reviewed by your peers, and they'll point out anything that's trash.
Your peers not necessarily being your mates.
Not being your mates, being
so
other people.
Other scientists around the world that are in a similar area, they read the article that you're putting forward and will judge it.
Kind of like a scientific validation process.
Yeah.
We'd hope it to be quite good. Okay, let's get down to what this actually did. And I still can't believe it. So, this study was done on 21 people, all of which were Jeanette's clients from her nutrition practice. There were 20 females and 1 male. So, 21 people, not a big sample size, and not representative, even in terms of gender, which is one of the easiest things to get a fair sample size for.
And also it's people that have been selected that aren't representative of the normal population.
These people
specifically that already know her.
Yeah, and they want to go on a diet to lose weight.
Yeah.
So they're not necessarily healthy. They're not necessarily unhealthy. They're looking to change lifestyle. Mm-hmm. What I could not believe when I read this paper is basically this woman went to meet these people either in her office, at their homes, or over Skype, and gave them details of this diet and asked them to fill in a questionnaire, which they'll fill in before and after. Mm-hmm. So the diet involves no alcohol, no sugar, no caffeine, no grains, no dairy, a cocktail of pre- and probiotics, protein with every meal, 3 meals a day, each day having 7 cups of fruit and vegetables, and over a week having about 20 to 30 different varieties of said fruit and veg.
So, speaking as someone who regularly tells their dentist that he flosses twice a day, that is a lot of instructions that are not necessarily
going to be followed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what I thought. So no one checked whether they'd weighed themselves properly.
So they just self-reporting.
So it's self-reporting. She just told them about the diet. No one checked that they were actually doing it properly. And so they apparently went away, did it for 4 weeks, whether or not they did it properly or not. And then they did this questionnaire again, which had, I think, 71 questions on it, which was about everything from weight to well-being. And she found that based on this self-report, some of them lost weight and some of them felt better, basically. And this led to her publishing an article, which its title is Microbiome Restoration Diet Improves Digestion, Cognition and Emotional and Physical Wellbeing, which is a claim, especially because she's not at any point looked at the microbiome of these people.
Yeah, she's only changed their diet and is assuming.
Exactly. And in the introduction, I think microbiome was mentioned 4 times in the first paragraph, and there's nothing on the actual microbiome in this paper.
So that technique we were just talking about, the 16S sequencing?
Nope.
Not used?
Not used.
That's interesting.
Which is interesting. And considering this is around, and this is fairly standard for microbiome research, would you say?
Yeah, it's step 1, for
it's
sure.
Step 1. The fact that she hasn't done that is diabolical, really. Also, just to add insult to injury, there was no control group. And they weren't blinded, so they knew what they were doing. They knew they were trying to lose weight.
Oh, as someone that regularly tells the dentist that he flosses twice a day, if a dentist asked me if I'd seen any improvement in the following the flossing,
exactly,
I'd report yes.
And does anyone tell the truth when they say how much alcohol they drink in a week when they see their doctors?
No.
Just go, it's about 2 glasses of wine a week.
Yeah, I lose count after a few pints.
Also, this pre- and probiotic cocktail. So prebiotics is what I mentioned before. Things that you eat that your normal bacteria like and also eat. So you're basically feeding your bacteria. They tend to be complex carbohydrates that we can't break down, but bacteria thrive on.
It's fertilisers for the grass in the garden.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And then probiotics are the grass itself.
Some seeds.
Some seeds, exactly.
Nice.
There was no specific details about what kind of prebiotics or probiotics, so this was not repeatable at all. And my personal favourite is all of the references in the paper to why this diet works. For example, quote unquote, foods which promote good bacteria, referenced her own book, which had just been published.
Just So immoral.
So immoral. All of these claims are not verified at all. And it also shows that she has a financial and commercial interest in this paper doing well.
Yeah. This sounds like a terrible article.
Yeah, and so it's been retracted.
It does not surprise me that it was retracted. It does surprise me that it was allowed through in the first place.
Yeah.
Especially if peer reviewers have objected prior to its publication, right?
Yeah, it is. And this is one of the issues, is that the microbiome is becoming a commercial hyped moment and trying to take advantage of this sort of emerging science. So, for example, it's predicted that by 2023, microbiome and probiotics will be worth about 48 billion, which is why you're doing your PhD on this, I'm sure. And we've got all sorts of claims out there. Probiotics can help with skincare, they can help as therapeutics, and they can help with your diet. And just to point out, because I feel like we've focused a lot on bacteria, your microbiome is a vast ecosystem. It can also be fungi and protozoa.
Mm-hmm. And an important point about the 16S sequencing is that fungi, it won't show on a 16S sequence.
Specific to bacteria.
Yeah, so even those studies that have used that technique are limited
I'm
because
still blinded to that.
they don't consider fungi.
So to leave you on a slightly more optimistic note, there is a reason why this is up and out there everywhere. It is emerging science. It's going to be very interesting very soon, especially with the emergence of some big data that's going into it. And this leads to an article that I read in The Guardian entitled, "Is Your Gut Microbiome the Key to Health and Happiness?" Which is a very nice idea. I'd like to think that, because I could change that and then I'd be happy, which would be quite nice. So this was basically an interview with John Cryan, who's a big name in this field. And it sort of looks at the historical studies behind the microbiome. One of the major things that started off all of this hype is that early age trauma in mice has been shown to have a risk factor for IBD. And IBD is associated with a less varied microbiome in these mice. In Japan, they created germ-free animals where they have a less diverse microbiome. And these animals showed elevated stress symptoms and a bunch of other things that were completely unexpected. And this led to a big theory, and it was a big splash, called the psychobiotic revolution. And this is basically potential mood-altering bacteria. So the question is, could certain bacteria act as a biomarker for various moods and maybe mental illnesses?
Seeing if you can find a relationship between which bacteria there and someone's mood or...
This is an idea that's it's really common in microbiome research, and it's part of the reason why it's so exciting. Because if a certain microbiome or a change to your microbiome happens just before you're going to get ill, then we can say, we've tested your microbiome, there's been a significant change, there might be a change to your health following it. Or you could look at it the other way, that there'll be a change to your health. You'll go into a disease state, and then immediately we will see a change to your microbiome. So potentially you could diagnose that really early.
The period that we're in now is looking at the human scale studies, and there's been a bunch of different bacteria that have been associated with different things. But a really interesting study is the link between post-traumatic stress disorder and your microbiome. So there was this one study which was entitled "The Microbiome in PTSD and Trauma-Exposed Controls," an exploratory study done in 2017 in psychosomatic medicine. And basically, they had people who suffered with PTSD and trauma-exposed controls. So these are people who've gone through a trauma but have not developed post-traumatic stress disorder. They did the 16S. So they extracted a poo sample, did the 16S that we've previously talked about, and found that people with PTSD had 3 types of bacteria that were significantly lower compared to the other ones. And it is theorised that the lower levels of these 3 bacteria could either be the cause or the consequence of these. But it sort of linked it quite nicely. And I like the idea that they'd done trauma-exposed controls, because that is quite a significant control group to sort of think of. So that's very clever.
The microbiome field in general it's really exciting, holds so much potential, but it's also so complicated. And we're really in the early stages of it at the moment. So
yeah.
We can make these amazing claims of what could happen, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, so the key point is it could happen.
Yeah, and I think that's the main point. It's because it's early days. There's lots of exciting research going on, but a lot of it we'll have to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and big companies that make these probiotics, they're running off the hype, so they don't need to do the hardcore research to show that it is working because they're already making profit.
I like to think less cynically that it's just enthusiasm, that people are like, this could happen, let's do it.
Yeah.
We're getting there, and I'm sure there's going to be loads of positive things to come out of it.
I suppose that kind of leads us to quite a nice end.
So it's important to be sceptical about anyone who's claiming to be very certain about what the microbiome can do, because it's early days and we want to investigate fully what we can do and how we can...
But it has some serious potential, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's really exciting at the minute, and it's definitely something that I'd suggest you follow, because there will be some great developments. But I would be wary of anyone that's definitive at the moment until we've seen the proof.
Thanks for listening to this podcast.
You can't say that, Katie.
We've been talking a lot of crap.
We have been talking... I think it can definitely be concluded that we have been talking a lot of crap.
We didn't get enough poo puns in.
Have You Heard have a number of projects exploring science in the news. For more information, visit our website, haveyouhearduk.com. If you have any questions or comments about the show, or have a headline that you'd like us to tackle, get in touch with us on Twitter at haveyouhearduk or email haveyouhearduk@gmail.com.
I collect poo for a living.
Soon you will be.
Soon I will be. I'm waiting on approval for people's crap.
We're all waiting on
I've filled
approval
out a
for
lot of
someone's
forms
crap.
to try and get people to give me their poo. And they just won't give me the poo.
There's so many methods or protocols that you look at, and ultimately it does come down to, here is a bucket, can you do a poo in it for me, please?